Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas, and I'm going to be your host again today, and we're going to be talking about winning at PR without a big budget. So many indie studios feel locked out of traditional PR, feeling like you need an agency and a big budget just to get noticed. So today we're going to break down how to earn meaningful media coverage with a story that's worth telling and how to create a system so you can share it. So, we're going to learn all about how a strategic approach to visibility can build credibility, attract players, and drive momentum, all without gatekeepers or expensive retainers. So, that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and we're back. And today with us, I have Shanté, Micah, and Josh Moody. How's it going, guys? And thanks so much for being here on the show.
That's good. Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah.
Glad to be here.
Well, it's going to be an exciting time. I can already tell because this is something I know a lot of people are curious about, want to talk about. But first, before we get even into the subject, folks, Shanté and Josh, they are both the founders of Good News, which is a PR company. And well, guys, I'm going to just let you kind of take the reins for a moment, introduce yourselves, tell us what is Good News. I'm sure you, and what your role's there, and a little bit more, whatever else you'd like to share.
Yeah. So good news. You are correct when you say a company, because most people think in the world that we are in, which is PR, they think agency immediately. And we are specifically not an agency. And our hot take is that PR agencies are a broken model for today. And we can get into that. But at Good News, we create what we call visibility systems. We engineer omnipresence. And we use a lot of tech. I come to the table with 20 years and all the frameworks. Josh comes to the table with all of that tech, engineering, marketing background. And from that, we've built a company that I wish I had for all 20 years that I was in the space of PR and brand marketing and brand awareness. So we built the company that we wanted for ourselves, the one that shifts with the PR agency model being broken.
Nice. I love that. And I mean, on the tech side, I mean, what kind of tech are we talking about here?
A lot of different things. So, I mean, right now with AI kind of changing the game, it's faster and easier than ever to spin up different custom apps to do all sorts of different workflows. And honestly, AI was one of the things that got us intrigued, because a lot of the systems that we're running within Good News are very laborious systems that historically would take a PR professional or a team of PR professionals hours and hours and hours to compile the research and all the data to create effective pitches, right? Instead of just kind of doing the cardinal sin of just blasting pitches out the door. So we're using a lot of AI in there to help us summarize data and compile data and things like that. And then the rest of the tech is largely just a common JavaScript based tech stack.
Okay, cool. So it's just like really kind of innovating the process, but in a way where, I mean, obviously more efficient, but I'm sure there's a lot more that can come out of it too, which we probably will maybe get into a little bit as well.
Yeah. I mean, what I brought to Josh was my wish list. So there is a frameworks when it comes to PR. We always talk about human first principles. But if you can do it at the scale in which Josh has been able to reverse engineer and productize to a certain degree while maintaining that integrity, it becomes this, impeccable storytelling process where when you reach out to someone, you get the OMG, yes, best pitch I've had in, over 100, or, this was stood out amongst, 1,000 cookie cutter pitches, because that research, all of those brand engines that Josh built, he's able to connect dots in a way that my human brain, even maxed out, and I've been doing this for 20 years. So it is really cool. I thought I was kind of closing the chapter on PR after 20 years, but I'm back and I'm excited. Yeah.
And I'm glad you called out to that too, because I know there could be some listeners, or just people in general about this idea or concept of AI. Just it gets thrown around a lot, like marketing does. But what was important to me, what I heard was human led first, and in terms of, it sounds like you guys been doing this, you had that process down, and then you're just looking at ways to leverage this tech in more meaningful ways, but again, still maintaining that human approach, which is super important. And it's not just like, oh, let's black box it, let's throw it in and see what it spits out, and then we're going to run with it. And that is clearly not the case. So thank you for
That's
clarifying
literally the
that.
words that we use, the black box.
Yeah.
Josh has coined that phrase where it's like PR has been in a black box for far too long.
Awesome. Well, and folks, that's why we're here, to kind of talk about these things in terms of like, how do we look at PR differently? I know that's not in the subject line, but that's essentially what we're going to be diving into. And the biggest thing is like, hey, there's ways, methods that we can execute this without the big budget. And I know that's always a concern for us, especially this day and age. Well, before we get into that conversation though, we are going to throw both of you into the Q box round. And folks, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Q box round, is just a few random questions we have for our listeners today. And if I'm stumbling my words a lot, everybody, it's simply because I am having some really high octane coffee right now. So I apologize. I just need the boost. It's been a long day. At any rate, folks, in particular, Shanté and Josh, are you guys ready for the Q box round?
Ready.
All right. First is, what's the most helpful or impactful advice you ever received?
I'll go first. So mine is always ship, but a version of that is launch it ugly, iterate later.
Yes.
Yep.
Nice. Mine would be, my dad always used to say, pick your battles, which I feel like is a different way of saying pretty much what Shanté was saying. Picking your battles so that you're not kind of fighting wars and battles that won't be productive. That's aided me far too much in life.
Yeah. Yep.
Awesome. All right. Next is, what's one habit you do to keep a clear and healthy mind?
So much walking, honestly. Like, get out in nature, touch grass, and walk it out. Because otherwise I would end up in a kind of a black hole in front of my computer for 12 hours a day.
Yep, absolutely.
Totally. Been there. Mine would be playing with my kids. I've got a 9 and an 11-year-old, and we just do all sorts of stuff. My 11-year-old is obsessed with Greek mythology, so we've been going down that rabbit hole, having Greek mythology quizzes powered by ChatGPT.
Oh, cool. Interesting. Sweet.
Awesome.
All right. And next but not least, and the staple here on the show, is, what game are you playing now?
So Josh probably has a different answer. Me, strictly the game of business building. I have zero time for anything else. Walking my dogs, walking myself. Business building.
Love it. I've been taking a deep dive into Hades lately.
Which one?
So like I said, the first one. Okay. So I'm going through the first one so that I can prep up for the second one. It is a phenomenal game. It is so gosh darn beautiful. And I love it because I'm a big fan of Greek mythology, but my son is too. So he's obsessed with chaos right now, out of all his primordial gods.
Nice. Yeah. I have yet to play Hades, but I don't know. Maybe I'm afraid because I'll get too hooked. But at any rate, glad you guys, you and your son are having fun with that. And yeah, I mean, thanks guys for letting us get to know you a little bit more. But now let's get into our conversation. And as I led in with the intro, we're here to talk about winning at PR, but without a big budget. And again, that's huge if we can make that happen. So to kick things off, I'm curious, guys, what do you think is kind of the biggest missed opportunity when it comes to, how studios and indies approach press and visibility?
So I would say not doing it in advance.
Hmm.
thinking that PR literally stands for press release when that is like the least effective approach to PR. And then probably not doing it because the idea is usually something to do with, well, I have to go find an agency or I have to have a PR person and an in-house team. Otherwise it's off limits. So those are probably the two things that I think lock out most studios from considering it as an option of a lot of incredible brand visibility and a lot of credibility.
Hmm.
Boy, I feel like there's another layer here too, kind of that coincides with exactly what Shanté is saying, which is it's kind of terrifying to get out there and start sending pitches out the door, especially when you're a creative, at an indie studio. That's what you do, is you create all of this magic all the time. When you get out there and start pitching for getting press, you're going to have some pitches that don't land or some no's. And that can feel a little heavy, as
Yeah.
you're just kind of getting that traction. It can make you question if the narrative you're telling is even correct. And so I think that there's a lot of kind of friction points there that, to Shanté's point, aid in why people just, they don't get started. They wait too long. They just kind of sit on their hands as they're like, well, I'm good at this stuff. I'm good at this storytelling, but not necessarily the storytelling of, hey, let's get out there and, share an intriguing story about the story. It's kind of meta in and of itself.
Yeah. Great points there too, because it sounds like, some of that can be relating to fear, unknown, these maybe like these beliefs that are formed that aren't necessarily true. And then the other type is storytelling, because it's like it's easy to, get into the creative and tell your own story and in your game and everything else. But then telling your story as you as a studio and stuff. I mean, I remember in college I took a autobiography course. I don't know why, but I did. And it was it was a huge mind shift, because it's like nothing in my life up to this point feels compelling as a young college student. And, there's a process of like, hey, there's ways to find out and to do that. But I wouldn't be able to do that without that kind of like guidance and such. And I think that, to your guys' point, that's kind of like where PR can be extremely helpful in how you're sharing and how you're telling that narrative, and what's not just meaningful, obviously, to you, but everybody else who's following.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, you hit on a good point where, so the storytelling aspect, you're already in the weeds on the best stories that resonate with journalists and podcast hosts or any members of the media, in that what do you think about most of the time, which is your player's experience. So you're very familiar with telling the story in a way that would make a stranger care. And that's what we have to usually with other brands, we have to remind them, well, it's about you, but it's not. It's actually about you in a way that would make a player, a client, a consumer be interested, because you're speaking their language. You're hitting on their pain points or their whatever they're wanting.
Yeah, I love that too, because it's like I look at it from a very similar way. It's like it's yes, it's like, well, the biggest thing I've come across too is I think I've mentioned him a few times, but Donald Miller, he does a thing, I forget, but he has some of these courses and stuff. And one of the things one specific thing he talks about is like your about you page, right? And I'm not saying go out and make an about you page or anything, but the problem is people are like, well, I'm just going to talk about myself in a way that just seems like, well, who cares? And it's just about me. But it's also as much as about you as it's showing how you are to everyone else in a way, like you just said, Shanté, is like in a way that they care, in a way that's like meaningful or whatever. So yes, you're still sharing some details about you, but it is still making it about them at the same time. But yeah, there's like an art to that and stuff.
There is an art. There's an art. There's a science. This is what Josh and I talk about all day, every day. That human first principle is, okay, how do we make a stranger care? And a strange, like pattern interrupts, the psychology
Yeah.
of creeping into someone's inbox cold and then getting them enough interest where they're like, okay, I'm going to read the rest of this. And it is an art. It is art, science combined.
So it sounds like then we keep talking about this idea and concept of storytelling. So it sounds like this is
Yeah.
kind of like a secret weapon. Well, in light of that, like what makes, a dev story, let's say newsworthy to media? Because I'm sure that's like the biggest problem we all face. Like how like I said about the autobiography course, how is this going to be compelling? How is this going to be newsworthy for anybody else to actually care?
I mean, I think Josh has some good takes on this. I'll say what doesn't make it newsworthy uh, if you try to like everyone else, if you
Mhm.
just you parrot what you see out there. If you try to be, and I mean the trying part of trying to be edgy and performatively
Or
is
clever.
that clever, yeah, overly clever because again, you made it about yourself versus those. So I would say I see what people do wrong, but yeah, Josh, what do your take on this? I think is great.
100%. One thing that I like, so like we mentioned, I historically come from a marketing background. So I'm like data focused. I love the data aspect of the storytelling, kind of what we're talking about with storytelling. And where I think of is, a lot of people will say, hey, this is my story. We see this all the time. People say, this is my story. This is how I'm going to tell it. And they can tell it, but it doesn't really hit. It doesn't get the reaction that they're looking for, but they're like, but this is my story, right? Well, there's a million ways to tell that story. There's a million different angles that you could take to tell that story. And not all of them are going to connect with a given audience, right? For instance, like Andrew, your audience here is going to be different than, say, another show that we have recently talked to that was all about, lawyers and getting PR in the law space. That same message wouldn't hit the same if we came out and said, hey, Andrew, we want to tell this story, but it's kind of, it's people use it in law, but it's more in law than it is indie gaming. It's not going to hit the same, right? And that gets down all the way to the subtleties. Obviously, that's an exaggerated example, but all the way down to the subtleties. And so what I think makes a story really newsworthy is adapting that story to the audience that you're speaking to and why it's compelling for them. And then I bring up the data aspect because the data is how you can know it's working. So let me give you like a really basic example because I feel like I love bringing everything back to action items. So say you're an indie studio and you want to test your story to see like, is this the right story that's hitting? I'm not talking about the story of your game. I'm talking about stories about the team that's making the game, the founder's journey that's making the game. Maybe your studio is really, really, really small and you have a really tight deadline, but you're hitting it because you're leveraging new tech or something like that. Those are the stories that are fascinating. Now, create a handful of angles around a given story that you think is interesting and then go out and literally start sending them out to different people, different podcasts. Let's just say podcasts. Find a handful of podcasts and tailor your story to those podcasts. Once you start emailing those out, start pitching, you're going to get real-time feedback as to what works and what doesn't work. And this is why I also say earlier on, get over that kind of fear, because once you send your first pitch, you're going to be like, oh, that wasn't that bad. And things are, I didn't die. I'm good to go. And then once you get that first response that comes back that, like Shanté says, is OMG, yes, this is awesome. This is a great story. Suddenly, now you're on cloud 9. And then you get on your first show and you're on cloud, 9 again, and you're stoked and you have all of this energy to move forward. But really what it's taught you is, hey, this is a way that my story connects. This worked. Let's do this a bunch more times, right? Let's test this out and stress test where the parameters are, where the kind of outsides are. And let's tell that story. And you can do that, many, many times. You shouldn't be just one story for every journalist. It should be tailored every single time. But you can then find out which artifacts in your story really resonate with your audience.
Yeah, and I would even say that most studios think, well, the launch of a product, the launch of something is the story. So that's one story. But, Josh mentioned the founder's story. We have hundreds of overlays that we talk about. We call them overlays, but it's relevant cultural conversations. There's things that are seasonality, trends. There's Mental Health Awareness Month. There's so many different months. And if you have an authentic way to speak to those things, then those are the stories. Those are the angles that you should be telling.
I like that last part there too, because I mean, Josh, a lot of great examples there. But Shantae, I mean, you mentioned authentic or authenticity, and I think a lot of us tend to forget, like, the importance of your own values, and then seeing what those are, and then aligning them with other people that you're looking to reach out to. That, like, because think of it this way: if you're trying to reach out to people, folks, for a favor, essentially, I mean, that's like a kind of a cold, hard ask. That's what makes it scary, because you and yourself know you need this awareness, but you might not feel authentic or almost a little sleazy sometimes about it. But
Yeah.
if you know something about that person, and you don't have to go into their history, like their lifetime, like thing, but if you know, like, hey, they're a big advocate for this type of organization or something, and that's something that aligns well with you, just share that connection briefly, and then go into everything else. And that's just one tiny way of your basically sharing your story, but it's just a tiny little bite-sized piece. It doesn't have to be a huge elaborate thing. And I love that too, because, in this game, authenticity is really a big factor about it, but sometimes it's a little challenging for people to, grasp or know how to effectively use it.
Yeah, and authenticity is an interesting thing because it's what's left when when anything of like action, I guess performing falls away. So it's hard to tell someone be authentic because then they're like,
Yeah.
well, how do I do that? How do I orchestrate that? But it's just what you said. And like Josh and I, we became business partners because of those aligned values. And that came over 10 years of just sidebar conversations. We were running our own teams, our own projects, but we could tell that we had similar values. And so when it came to business, it was a hell yes. And then everything that we put together, like my pitch to you, it demonstrated that I had taken a beat to understand you enough, and also your audience, because I know that's what you care about the absolute most. So connecting those dots and doing it in a way that I don't inundate, because you are creeping into their inbox, but make it easy. Make it easy for them to see, oh, they spent a minute with me and we do have some shared interest. And yeah, either the next thing is let's get you on the show, or I have some questions,
Yeah. And, to that point, I'll use a real example. Part of the reason that these guys aren't here on the show today is because they did do this outreach, and they knew exactly how to position the email, what mattered, and everything to us and everything. And it was like pretty much an immediate yes. Now let's just, go through the topic and what we're covering. And I only say that too, because you guys mentioned it as it relates, using podcasts as an example. And I've get tons of requests to be on the show, and you can easily tell the people that are playing a numbers game. And then you could easily tell the people that care about, hey, we don't just want to create awareness, but we actually want to create meaning and value for this audience. And those people shine out. And I got into a point where we just delete all the other inquiries because it's obvious, right? So it
Well, let's
goes
talk
one
about
way.
that because I think that's valuable to know. I'll give you what we hear. Josh and I hear a lot from people who are like, yes. And later they'll be like, I get a lot of pitches where it's just their bio. It's
Yeah.
just like, here's my bio.
Thanks.
You connect the dots. Yeah. That's a bad pitch. Don't do that. That's not a pitch, actually. But don't do that.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Why don't we talk about this a little bit more? Because I'm sure there's some like common traps and such that we can all fall into and stuff. But like, hey, when we're pitching our games, like to press, or let's say to anybody, what are some of these traps we might fall into, or that we see people falling into?
So it's really easy to take a swipe file that either someone in PR or storytelling says, oh, this is the swipe. Like this is the thing and that's your template. There are some best practices, things like keeping any pitch to 200 words or less. At that point, you have no business giving them more. Like let them have a follow-up question. Otherwise, it's too much. And you have to consider that hosts like yourself, journalists, they receive hundreds, some of them multiple hundreds in a given day of pitches.
Oh, yeah.
So I would say there are some best practices, but like Josh, I mean, you can talk about this for what you've built for us. It's been
I
being able to do that deep research and then connect it in a way that's not overly clever, but human.
think that's the key is really, we talk about AI systems, we talk about kind of all of this complexity, and you nailed it, Andrew, when you said like, it's just about not being transactional and being a person.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's literally been our North Star for, no, figuratively been our North Star for all of this build is how can we offload kind of tasks that can be offloaded to AI so that we can still be human and we can still connect on a human level first. And then, if there's a good fit and everything works out, then great. We get exposure and it's mutual because we're friends now, right? We're not just, hey, we want something here. And so that's really where I start to see a lot of these errors. People see AI and it's amazing, but then they'll do one-shot blog posts and publish them. They'll do one-shot email pitches just because they'll throw in a blog post that says, this is how you create a pitch in a chat GPT and say, hey, create my pitch. and then they'll send them, right?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that doesn't, maybe it's fortunately, that doesn't work because it's disingenuous. It's not that authentic connection. So really, that's where I see the biggest error is people trying to score too early, trying to score that goal. And instead, look, let's create the relationship correctly. And then this is also, this kind of goes into that same traps bucket. That relationship isn't a one and done. That relationship is yours. And this is where we feel the agencies, specifically PR agencies, are kind of becoming broken. And it's not because of the PR agency. It's because I think the model is being shifted and shuffled right now where these PR firms can go out and they can pitch your story, but then they retain that connection, right? They still have that Rolodex. They can still lean on that. And this is where I see a huge opportunity for indie game studios. You start making those connections. And to Shanté's point, you do that way earlier than launch. You're going to have so many friends and advocates in the space for launch time, for when you need that message to be amplified. But then you also are building an audience all along the journey that people are invested. You talk about Donald Miller, he's a story brand author, right?
Great book.
So it's kind of that methodology of, you're bringing them along as the hero, right?
Yep.
And they're so fascinated with what you're doing because you're going to make them the hero, as they play this game, as they embody your work. So it always comes back to that human first kind of aspect.
Yeah.
So, all right. So we're talking, I wholeheartedly agree too, that human touch approach, regardless of the methods that are used to help create these pitches and such, or developing the story, right? It's still that human approach. But, just for the sake of some, additional context, I mean, are there any examples, let's say, of a game or a studio that like kind of really nailed the story and leading with that, let's say, human or empathetic approach?
So when I think of really, really good stories, and this is probably inclusive of even books, I always go back to the game BioShock, the series BioShock.
Mhm.
I know it's not indie. I know it's pretty large, but that story is so incredible that is told throughout not just one game, but many games. In fact, going all the way back to the first game, System Shock, back in the 90s. And what I love about this is, yes, that game is amazing. We could talk about that game and all the intricacies. But what I love about it is it reflects this more macro loyalty. So Ken Levine, who was the brains behind that game, created BioShock and all the amazing, vivid worlds that you go into. But he's working on a new game after many, many years, right? He's working on Judas now. And like the amount of momentum that I see from that already, just from people that were so impacted by the past stories that he told and now are all completely bought in and invested. Whether Judas comes out and it's amazing, whether it comes out and it's a flop, I know for one, I'm going to buy it, but it's because I like Ken Levine, the person. I like the stories that he tells, and on down the line. So I feel like that for me is huge. And that story resonates even outside of that. You see people with BioShock tattoos all the time,
Oh yeah.
the would you kindly tattoos. You see all of those things, which is fascinating. It just goes to kind of permeate the human nature of storytelling. It connects on a visceral level of, hey, these are the principles in that story. So even more macro than just PR. I mean, those stories, they can bleed through to your soul in all aspects of life if done right.
Yeah. And I think one thing I'll call out too here, and I love this example, but to kind of like extrapolate a little bit too, because this is something I try to share as well with people, is that, well, some people might be listening to the example that you provide and thinking, oh, well, some of these things are really, really like game specific, but really think about it, because think about like Ken Levine and the work that he has done and everything else. But what are his values, his principles, and how is he implementing these concepts and other things that make him up as a person into a game, into what he wants to see and do, because whatever his reasons are, but those are all like, it's a part of him and that vision that's ingrained into the game. And I think that's an important connection to make, because sometimes when we look at these things, we're like, oh, this is my game and this is about me, and they are very separate things. It's like, but you guys are very passionate about what you're doing and you're putting your souls into this, like literally, right? Like, so to be able to see those connections with things and take them out, so that way you are telling a narrative that is you, as much as it is about game, as much as it is about your audience too, and making it about them. And it's just this really cool alignment that can go on, but sometimes I think a lot of us don't see it that way.
Oh, you have to. We're in the world of personal brands. We call it the celebrity CEO, and that's just coined for whoever's really that spokesperson. It really should be, people like you. You're in the weeds with everything, but you holistically, how to tell the behind the scenes that most people are curious about. Media is changing. Media is, if you've watched any of like big media, so many layoffs. Journalists are responsible for more stories. They need your pitches, but we're even seeing more and more Substacks as considered media, more very niche specific, very privatized type of like channels as becoming the new media. And most people should be, whether you're an employee or you're the founder of something, you should be building a personal brand. That is future proofing almost everything that you do under your own personal brand. But I have worked primarily in this world of corporate and big brands. And the easiest stories to place are from the executives, because they're like way more interesting. And then through that, they're able to talk about a mission, initiatives, a product maybe, but that's the least interesting part.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a good point. And I mean, hey, even though Shanté was giving an example that related to like corporate speak and corporations and stuff, what the point is like, as a CEO or as, the solo dev or as a team leader or whatever, you're the one at its core, you're the one who has that vision. And regardless of how well you communicate that with the rest of your team or everybody else, it's ingrained into you. It's part of you, and other people might not know it as well. So that by default, you're going to be the most interesting person to talk about, whether that's something that, you want to do or not. And if not, there's ways around it. But if you do, I mean, that's what makes you so interesting and stuff. And looking at it from that perspective, I think is important. And sometimes you do have to get out of that comfort zone. And if it's really hard or it could set off triggers, then there are other ways and solutions around that too. So
Yeah, there's lots of, we do media training, but really you can go through hours of media training to be prepared. And really, it really comes down to recall. So your ability to tell, honestly, the things that you probably told 100 times throughout the course of building something, that's the story that is going to resonate. That's the thing where you're going to get in a state of flow, and it's going to be, I'm not anxious about being picture perfect. And those are the stories that journalists are going to say, well, they were really a credible source. They're a subject matter expert.
Yep.
And they were able to make it incredibly relatable, which is what all of us want. If you're going to tell a story, don't give me a mission statement. Give me the, like, what would you say if you were sitting in your pajamas and just talking to, a friend?
Yeah. And again, that goes back to that human touch. And just another side comment here. There's so many times too when I people that I follow in different industries and areas and such, where I'm surprised to learn, like, they come out and they're like, say that, oh, I'm really an introvert. And every time before I get up on a stage, I'm like freaking out. But I've done this so many times. I'm familiar with the process. I know what I'm talking about. I know my story and how it resonates with people. So even in that moment of fear, it's easy. I shouldn't say easily overcome, but it's still overcome because they know that about them. It's refined, and then they just go out and do it. And then, the rest is history. It goes away, and it just, like, it's like a roller coaster with life in general.
Yeah, those are my favorite people to work with, honestly. The people that are, they're curious. They're curious about, how to exist, like, on a stage, but do it in a way that makes it a really good experience for the people on the other end, versus being like, I'm so great. I'm masking with arrogance. A lot of that.
Yeah, absolutely. As we're talking about this, I know that, like, some of us are probably thinking like, okay, no, this makes sense and everything, but, like, how do I really start to put myself out there? And I'm kind of curious, like, what would you say is a solid, like, I don't know, visibility system? Like, what does that look like for a small indie team? Because I'm sure some of what we're talking about, they're like, all right, well, that sounds great, but what's getting me out there? Is there a system I could use that really starts generating this type of stuff that we're discussing?
Yeah, Josh has a lot to say on this because he's literally built the system. But it does have to be a system that you can do within the business of your business. We're very aware that a whole download of even theory is just, it's not going to help you. You have to get into action. So you have to get into what Josh was saying earlier, those reps, sending the pitches out the door. But the system comes with, can you connect those dots in a way that's scalable so that you can get enough pitches out the door to make it make sense? But in terms of the system, Josh has really codified, kind of productized so that people can do it within an hour, maybe 2 per week.
Totally. And I'll give you a kind of a basic run through of what I would recommend to an indie game studio trying to get this, press, trying to get the ball rolling. And honestly, so when we break these systems down, we kind of break it down into a few different components. You might hear us refer to these three components as the connecting index, storytelling index, and the pitching index. And really, I'll walk through those really quickly. The connecting index is basically the who you need to connect with. So I would start, if I was just, speaking to a friend that's an indie game developer, I would say, look, open up a spreadsheet and start compiling a list of podcasts that you would want to be on. I would start with podcasts. You can start with podcast websites, top media, local media. There's a million places to go. What we would say is, let's start with podcast, because everybody can jump on iTunes, Libsyn, find a list and start looking at podcasts that are relevant. And I would aggregate a list of a handful of podcasts. I would say, 20 to 50. That's what we would call our connecting indexes. Those are the seeds of the connecting index, right? Your targets that you're going to reach out to. The next thing that you need to get is the story, right? What are the story angles that you are going to tell to these people? So this is where we would say, go down the list of those podcasts on your connecting index and start to write out how your story would benefit their audience. What could you give to benefit their audience and to them as creators? And so once you have all of those stories down, do it on the same doc. That's going to be your storytelling index. You're going to have a host of a lot of different stories. And like we mentioned earlier, you're going to be able to position them and angle them slightly different. So once you have a handful of stories, you're really going to have a handful of like core stories that represent you, your brand, your mission. And then you're going to have your angles tailored to each one of these outlets. And then the third part comes kind of the tricky part, the pitching index. But if you followed kind of creating your connecting index, your storytelling index, and you've got those dialed, the pitching index is really the merging of those two assets, where you can then say, okay, look, this person's a real human. This is my story. This is how I'm going to reach out to them. This is what's valuable. You can create a pretty effective pitch. And like Shanté said, we try to keep it, we recommend keeping it pithy, right? Less than 200 words. Keep it really short to the point and value driven. Focus on them. Don't focus on you. Focus on them and being an asset to them, helping them accomplish their mission. So those are kind of the first kind of core, those are the core three elements of the system. Now there's there's like a fourth component here, which is, it's a system, right? That's what we've been talking about. It's a system. And systems are something that you can run over and over and over time. And that becomes really the crux of the success. Some people are like, oh, I'm getting really excited. I listen to a podcast like this. I'm on fire. I get out the door and I start sending a bunch of pitches. And then maybe they get a handful of positive, maybe they get a handful of negative, and then they kind of fizzle out. But that's not what the system's for. The system is, hey, carve out 15 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, whatever you've got. Do the pitches, do the thing. Stop there. And then tomorrow, rinse and repeat, and do it again and again. Because it's really the amalgamation of all of these efforts over time where you start to see, oh, wow, we're really gained a lot of traction. One concept here, Shanté and I talk a lot about effortless omnipresence. And that's really the goal that you're working towards, is being effortlessly in everyone's minds. It's not about the launch. It's, hey, we've built up all of this capital over time so that we're where we need to be, for those right moments. So having a system that allows you to continually pitch, it's going to get you there.
I love that last part that you called out too, because I think it's something that a lot of us don't necessarily think about at face value, which is, you said, effortless omnipresence. Because I'll give you an example, folks. There's probably people you follow that you might give you, whatever platform, that might give you the impression like, oh my goodness, how is this person where they are today and always on this freaking platform? Like, how is that even humanly possible? And what's that's the impression they give, right? They're omnipresent. It looks like they're always active and everything. And sometimes it doesn't compute. But it's because more often than not, it's these systems. If any of you are familiar with Gary Vee or know who he is, he's a pretty influential person in the entrepreneurship world. And it's been well known that he is probably the busiest guy and also the one that seems is always omnipresent. And I'm not saying to do this, but he also, from what I understand, has a team of at least like 5 to 10 people that are on his socials responding to every single comment. So, but that's the impression he gives. It looks like it's him doing all that stuff. Now, that's an extreme example, but that's a lot of the times what you're seeing. And working towards that through those reps that Josh is talking about are going to be able to get you to that spot, to that position. And I mean, the end result, it could relate to a lot of things. It's like it all comes back to the end result being, how does that tie into your objective? And then how is it meeting your goals and everything? So I love that you said that, because sometimes I think we look at this online space, we think about, oh, how are we even going to get to that point? It doesn't happen overnight. It is like working a muscle, and it takes time and some dedication, but you can get there.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about having a pipeline that you feed. And yeah, maybe you front load it, or maybe if you have a launch coming, you decide to double down for a period of time. But the pipeline is the pipeline. The pipeline is the effort of you just keep feeding it with pitches out the door. And in everything we do, we weight everything. So there's phases. So, if someone says, well, just get me on Joe Rogan, someday we'll write that story, the journey to Joe Rogan. The truth is, Joe Rogan's producers come to you. You probably don't, just pitch him and get an immediate yes. So the pipeline creates leverage. There's a lot of podcasts that are very niche specific that you should probably be on, and will probably actually get you bigger bang for your buck if we're talking about bottom line value. And that's leverage. And if you just start showing up on those, you start showing up on, industry publications. If you're a contributor to, other publications, digital publications, then we start talking top national. And people start seeing you. And Joe Rogan's producers are like, well, we should probably talk to Andrew. He's, the industry authority on this very specific thing. But it comes with a pipeline, and it comes with just feeding that pipeline.
Yeah.
And it takes less time than you would think if you systemize it.
Yeah.
But getting started is usually it's one more thing to do. But I'm telling you, if you think of it as a content strategy too, from this just conversation that we're having here, how many snippets do you think we'll have that would be served up on social and could be served up again and again?
Oh my goodness.
It's kind of insane. And that was one pitch out the door. Maybe one pitch and a follow-up or two.
Yeah.
And what you get on the other end is something that you can amplify and atomize and serve up for years and years.
Right. And it's still all true to you. And the only thing that might change is,
Yep.
hey, if you change over time, then just tweak and update accordingly. And I love, even though it's like a real big example and not necessarily one that everybody can either would relate with, with the Joe Rogan one, but ultimately, if you think about that, there's this level of psychology involved too, which is like association, right? Like when you're making these connections and stuff, and you it's a little steps. You take little steps, and then even like when you get to a point where you're name dropping and things like that, these are all psychological things that we don't realize. Or we think like, oh, if I just name drop, it's like, being associated in some way, shape, or form with these entities, whether someone's covering you, whether it's that, it signals to everybody else, oh, this person's like either popular or whatever. And it's not to say that's your motive. You're just telling your story that's true and authentic and everything. But these things, they do have an impact from a psychological perspective that we generally don't think about that way. But if you understand and know that, and obviously we're not here to talk about ways to exploit it. We're here to talk about how you can use that understanding in meaningful ways. That's how all this that we're talking about can get you on your path faster than you may anticipate.
Totally. And one aspect that we talk about all the time. So Andrew, you probably heard of dark social, which in our marketing world, dark social is, all these conversations that happen on social or in real life. It's kind of like the more modern word of mouth, right? And these happen and they're hard to track. So it's hard to have attribution for these dark social conversations. Well, we started talking about dark credibility, and which is, to your point, what are all these credibility signals that are they're really psychological principles that happen that you kind of pick up on a subconscious level where you're like, this person's credible or not. You nailed it. One of those big components is association. Are they showing up on the right shows? Are they rubbing shoulders with the right people? And so to Shanté's point, that's why we roll things out in a weighted system. So if you're if you're an indie studio, I would say start on smaller emerging podcasts, get some of those under your belt. You're going to refine your message, your storytelling, but then you're going to be able to leverage those for the next tier up, and then the next tier up, and the next tier up. And that's really how you hit the Joe Rogans, right? You've built the credibility over time, and you've incrementally leveled up that dark credibility. Dark not as an evil, but as an unseen credibility where, you are everywhere and people resonate with that because, yeah, this person is a thought leader. Our tagline is we make thought leaders. And this is really kind of that blueprint of becoming a thought leader, is naturally becoming that voice in the space that everyone's like, no, they're a thought leader. It's harder to say quantifiably, they're a thought leader because X, Y, and Z metric. It's an amalgamation of tons of quantifiable metrics and qualifiable attributes.
Yeah, absolutely. And folks, if you're looking for a real current live example of this happening now with someone, I would say follow Philonema Schwab of, Strayfon Studio, because I think recently she just got on a major local news network. It is in Swiss German, but she was interviewed on a major television network for talking about they did different segments about growing and emerging industries, I think, in that region. And she was the one that was being interviewed for that. I mean, you can't think of a better example that completely aligns to what, Joss and Shanté are talking about. So just figure to throw out there too. And it relates to everything they're saying too, because if I forget, I apologize. I don't know the past episode number, but our episode with her, Philomena, was about tackling side quests while still working on your main mission. Main mission, she's building up a studio, a publishing studio, but the side quests are all these other things that we're basically talking about here today that relate. So, in light of all this and stuff, I know part of what we look at too is like, okay, we take these small steps and everything, but a lot of us out there probably have spent any time or effort and are starting with zero contacts, right? But like, what are things to just kind of get started, and then how can we kind of continue to build those relationships?
Yeah. So the starting point is usually starting with like those 10, that first round of 10 that Josh talked about. So we'll keep going back to podcasts because I recommend all people consider podcast as the new media of building your brand.
And quick question though, not I didn't mean to
Yeah.
interrupt, but I'm sure some people are thinking, why podcasts? Like, give us a reason why podcasts. I agree, but I want to hear from you guys why podcasts, because yeah, I'm sure people are questioning.
So Don Priestley just did a sit down with, what's his name? Sean from Diary of a CEO. His first name. You'd recognize the show, but Don Priestley, he has built multiple billion-dollar enterprises and then sold them. And he will tell you that when it comes to the best type of visibility strategy, podcasts are the only place where you get people's attention for more than 20 seconds. Any other channel, we're all experiencing ad fatigue, and we're seeing this in attribution as well. Josh just talked about the lack of attribution of dark social. People aren't paying attention. If they're on social media, they're not paying attention.
Lots of noise.
Your ads are just like a blip before they jump. Commercials, other than Super Bowl commercials, who's really watching those, with bated breath? But podcasts are still getting, not only are you getting people that stick around, but people that consume them like fans. It's not just one episode. One episode could turn someone into a fan. And then they're sticking around for 20 minutes, 40 minutes, sometimes 3 hours. And they're actually immersing themselves. That's the podcast experience. So that's why we recommend everyone, if you're going to do anything, start with podcasts. You're going to have the attention of that audience, and that borrowed audience is pretty significant. You as a host, you've curated an audience, and you're allowing Josh and I to come and just borrow some time. And everyone's assuming that Josh and I are good enough to pass the Andrew test in your production team. So they're not thinking, well, do I trust them? They're thinking, well, what do they have to say? Is it applicable to me? So that's why we started podcasts. It's a great platform.
There are a couple of other components too that kind of get even more out there. I mean, we're seeing this not just in this space, but in all spaces. I mean, we saw it even most recently with the US presidential election, where, you'd have Donald Trump and JD Vance going on different podcasts to tell that story, as opposed to the traditional kind of
you're right,
machine. So you're starting to see it permeate all over. And why is that so exciting? Well, to Shanté's point, it's like having a sit down with person to person. It's human first. We get to understand who the person is. Anybody can bull crap for a handful of clips. It's easy to bull crap for a couple minutes here and there, but it's hard when you're sitting down, with Andrew for an hour and you're telling the story and you're getting to know each other. And I feel like that then it breeds more of that dark credibility. Hey, this person's they're a real one, they're not just trying to sell a product. And then one other point I'll bring up here, this comes from my marketing mind. I love podcasts because there's so many downstream effects of podcasts.
Yeah.
You don't need to create your own podcast in order to maximize that visibility. So if you're an indie game studio, you probably don't have a ton of time to be like, I'm going to create my own podcast and then I'm going to clip up all the clips and then I'm going to syndicate them. Then I'm going to promote them on social correctly. And then I'm going to rake in the backlinks correctly. And then I'm going to point them, you know what I mean? Like it just gets really complex. But if you go on someone else's show, you're building credibility, you're building authority, you're getting those links as they go live. You can then also help chop it up and promote the show, which does Andrew a lot of good. That does us a lot of good. It helps the users that are listening. And it really is, in my opinion, one of the most purest forms of just value creation without having the overhead of a big team and all the other kind of marketing components. So it kind of all thunderclaps at this critical juncture that really maximizes your leverage. That's why we say podcasts, I guess.
Awesome. Well,
We like podcasts.
thank you so much for that, really detailed response. And if I start getting a ton of guest requests, I'm holding both of you accountable. But anyways, it's all good. No, that just means you guys listening care. That's all that I if that happens, that means you guys really care, and that's good to see. That's what I want.
Yeah.
All right. So I apologize, folks, for the digression. But just to go back and to kind of wrap things up, getting started, you have that list of people to reach out to. And then like, I know earlier you mentioned like personalization. So probably some level of understanding like, hey, who am I actually reaching out? So you show like your care. What else can do so people can get started? You have a list, you understand who they are, know a little bit about them. Anything else to kind of,
Well, let me break
up?
down the structure of a pitch very, very quickly. So our pitch to you, we specifically mentioned the show, but you could do that. You could do that with a script, right? So the point was that first initial line of any type of pitch, and again, we're trying to keep this to 200 words, is, hey, I have a story idea. And I like to have a pattern interrupt in there where I'm like calling out the elephant in the room, where I'm saying, absolutely creeping into your inbox, hopefully with value, right? Make it like there's a person behind it. Very brief introduction. I think ours is 2 sentences. And it is, this is who we are. Like we exist for this reason. And then it's about your audience. So in your pitch in particular, I think we said, we know that your audience cares about these things. And we called them out specifically to your show and to the space in which you are in. They were not generic at all. And then it was simply, here's the idea. Josh and I would love to jam on this. Josh and I would like to do a deep dive. And it was 3 bullet points. And again, they were specific to how your audience would consider them. And then that was it. The last line was like, I hope, if this is a fit, let me know. We'd love to talk about this. Signature. Have a signature with at least a link.
Yeah.
Because what we hear from a lot of journalists, a lot of hosts, they say they don't want a bunch of attachments, but they do want to be able to click on a link and know that you're real and that there's a little bit of substance behind it. So if you're going to have a single link, have it be in your signature. And then the rest is just, that's enough. That's enough to either for someone to say yes or no. Follow-ups to a pitch, no more than 2. And then say, okay, closing the loop. That doesn't mean that contact's dead. It means that it wasn't the fit right then or the story right then. It was a matter of timing. So yeah, that's kind of the structure of a good pitch. And then do that enough times in a given week that you will start to get yeses. You'll start to book out months in advance. You'll start to have, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 interviews per week just with podcasts.
Yeah, I love that. And you know what? When Shanté was breaking out that whole process, or the breaking out the whole pitch, I was now recalling it, and I was like, the one thing I'll just comment on real quick about that too is, this is the other thing you can't forget, and which is what they did. They made my life and my team's life easier because they pitched an idea, they made sure it aligned. I'm like, hey, look, we already have something to run with. like part of my process too is like when you schedule your interview, you need to fill in what is the topic.
Yep.
And there's lots of different ways that that happens. But guess what? They were already done. So they already prepared. It takes no time or effort for them to pop in the idea because they already came up with it. And then for me and my team, there's nothing that we really like. We already had a good, strong starting point, and it just made everybody's life easier. So again, those things. And then the other thing I want to add that I love too is when you came in saying like, "Hey, look, I know I'm like creeping into," like a lot of times is you're addressing the potential or expectation of, hey, if this person's busy or whatever, and they could confront me with a no. But you're like, if you confront or agree with it, well, a person on something like that, then there's not going to be a dispute. There's not going to be any conflict really. They'll be like, oh,
Yeah.
okay. And it diffuses people too. And we don't realize that happens. But when you do that, it diffuses them. They're like, okay, I'll listen. And it's like, and all you did was just suddenly say, hey, I'm being mindful of your time. I know this might seem a little off, whatever the case is. If you address that potential conflict right off the bat, it diffuses the situation and then gives you even more of an opportunity to have these connections happen. So great
Thank
job,
you.
guys.
Because that's the thing that I've told Josh. I'm like, this is my framework. Like I have to do it's I don't know if it's just the psychology of pitching or just the pattern interrupt of like, hey.
Yeah. Right. But
We're all people out here doing something.
exactly. And it's those
I'm
things that help us stand
absolutely
out.
infiltrating your inbox.
Yeah, I'm
Pulling
doing
out,
it, but hear me out. Okay. Awesome.
yes.
Well, I know, man, I feel like we could talk about this stuff for forever, but I know we're coming on time. So what are some tips, suggestions based off of everything we talked about that we can share with our listeners today?
Yeah. So when you pitch your game, pitch why it matters. Story beats, features, specs. Visibility is a system. And it's not a sprint. You put in the reps, but you have to consider once you get started, just don't stop. Even if it means you can just get one pitch out in a given week, that's just don't stop.
Yep.
And then relationships and rapport, especially with hardened journalists, they're hit up all the time and you can be blacklisted if you just don't demonstrate the simple act of respect. So human first principles means it's not transactional. It means that you are looking to build rapport and be respectful.
Absolutely. All very great points.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I can't thank you guys enough. This has been really exciting and everything else. And I think it's really giving us all a different perspective on how to approach PR. But as we close, what are some good ways people can find out more about you guys, connect? Please drop us some links. And is there something else that you have available for listeners?
Yes. So if you go to highgoodnews.com, and that's HI as in hello, highgoodnews.com, we have a banner right now and it's in orange and it takes you to an intake form. And it's basically, if you wanted to get a sampler list of podcasts, we will curate some for you. So click on that link and it's like a 2-minute intake and it takes us about 2 days to create that for you because we are creating a list that's bespoke to you. And that's one way to get started, just like we've been talking. And within that, we'll send you that framework on pitches. You don't have to remember from this conversation, but you can be in that ecosystem and just, I don't know, at some point you're going to want a little bit more theory. We've got that. You're going to want maybe a little bit more support. We've got that too. So highgoodnews.com, look for that banner and opt in.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Folks, if you were even remotely thinking about getting started on what we talked about, well, there you go. You got a great resource to do. Again, highgoodnews.com. You guys are both on LinkedIn. And folks, all of these links and everything will be in the show notes. Guys, Josh, Shanté, I can't thank you enough. It has been a pleasure having you on the show today.
Thank you, Andrew.
Appreciate it.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.